In the darkest chapters of medieval European history, few names evoke such visceral terror as Vlad III of Wallachia. Known to history as Vlad the Impaler, this 15th century ruler transformed cruelty into an art form, leaving behind a legacy so horrifying that it would inspire legends for centuries to come. His methods were so extreme, so barbarously calculated, that even hardened medieval warriors who had witnessed countless battles would flee in horror at the mere mention of his name. The year was 1456, when Vlad began his most notorious reign, a period that would see the systematic implementation of terror as a tool of governance. What sets Vlad apart from other tyrants of his era wasn't merely the scale of his brutality, but the deliberate psychological warfare he waged against enemies and subjects alike. He didn't simply kill, he orchestrated death as a public spectacle, turning execution into theater designed to break the human spirit. Medieval Europe was no stranger to violence, yet Vlad's methods shocked even the most battle-hardened observers of his time. Contemporary chroniclers, men who had documented the horrors of the 100 Years' War and witnessed the fall of Constantinople, found themselves struggling to find words adequate to describe what they had seen in Wallachia. Their accounts, preserved in monastery records and diplomatic correspondence, paint a picture of systematic cruelty that defied comprehension. The Ottoman Empire, despite its own reputation for ruthlessness in conquest, would ultimately retreat from direct confrontation with Vlad, not due to military might, but because of the sheer psychological trauma inflicted by his methods. Sultan Mehmed II himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, reportedly experienced nightmares after witnessing the aftermath of Vlad's handiwork. This was a ruler who had seen empires fall and cities burn, yet Vlad's cruelty proved too much even for him. What makes Vlad's story particularly chilling is the calculated nature of his actions. These weren't crimes of passion or battlefield fury, but carefully planned acts of psychological warfare designed to achieve specific political and military objectives. Every impalement, every public execution, every act of terror served a purpose in Vlad's grand strategy to maintain power and defend his realm. The methodical precision with which he approached human suffering reveals a mind that had transformed cruelty into science. The political landscape of 15th century Wallachia was treacherous, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Hungarian kingdom. Vlad had spent his youth as a hostage in the Ottoman court, where he learned not only their military tactics, but also their methods of psychological intimidation. This education in terror would prove instrumental when he returned to claim his throne, armed with knowledge of how fear could be weaponized more effectively than any sword or cannon. Wallachia itself was a relatively small principality, unable to match the military might of its larger neighbors through conventional means. Vlad understood that his survival depended not on winning battles through superior numbers, but on making the cost of conquest so psychologically devastating that enemies would choose withdrawal over victory. This strategic insight led him to develop methods of warfare that prioritized mental anguish over physical destruction. The 7 acts of horror that would define Vlad's legacy were not random acts of madness, but calculated moves in a deadly game of medieval politics. Each atrocity served multiple purposes, eliminating political rivals, deterring future challenges to his authority, and creating a reputation so fearsome that enemies would surrender without a fight. Understanding this context doesn't excuse his actions, but it helps explain how one man's cruelty could reshape the balance of power across Eastern Europe. The first and most infamous of Vlad's methods was impalement, a form of execution so cruel that it became synonymous with his name. Unlike quick beheadings or hangings common in medieval justice, impalement was designed to maximize suffering while providing a public spectacle that would terrorize observers. The process began with victims being stripped naked and forced to lie on the ground while soldiers prepared the implements of their doom. The stakes used for impalement were not random pieces of wood, but carefully crafted instruments of torture. Craftsmen would select sturdy oak or pine poles, usually 8 to 10 feet in length, and meticulously sharpen one end to a point. Not too sharp, as a quick death would defeat the purpose. The poles were then oiled to ease insertion while ensuring the victim would survive the initial trauma long enough to experience prolonged agony. The actual process of impalement required skilled executioners who had perfected their gruesome craft through repeated practice. The stake would be inserted through the victim's rectum and slowly pushed through the body, carefully avoiding vital organs to ensure the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. Master executioners could keep victims alive for hours, sometimes even days, as the stake gradually worked its way through their torso. Vlad's innovation lay not just in the method itself, but in the scale and theatrical presentation of mass impalement. He would order hundreds, sometimes thousands of stakes to be prepared simultaneously, creating vast fields of suffering that stretched beyond the horizon. These forests of the impaled became his signature calling card, visible from miles away and serving as monuments to his absolute power over life and death. The psychological impact on observers was immediate and devastating. Soldiers approaching these fields would hear the collective screaming and moaning of hundreds of dying victims long before they saw the horrible spectacle. The sound alone was enough to break the morale of even veteran warriors, many of whom would abandon their posts rather than march through such a hellscape. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical way Vlad would inspect his impalement fields, walking calmly among the dying while issuing orders for the placement of new stakes. He reportedly took pleasure in the geometric precision of the arrangements, ensuring that the stakes were properly spaced and aligned for maximum visual impact. This attention to detail revealed a mind that found aesthetic satisfaction in human suffering. The victims of impalement came from all walks of life: captured soldiers, political rivals, common criminals, and entire families accused of disloyalty. Vlad made no distinction between man, woman, or child when it came to this ultimate punishment. Pregnant women were impaled alongside their unborn children, while elderly nobles who had served his predecessors were subjected to the same fate as common thieves. The international reaction to these mass impalements was one of horror and disbelief. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows that even hardened medieval rulers, accustomed to harsh justice, were shocked by the scale and systematic nature of Vlad's executions. Ambassadors returning from Wallachia struggled to convince their masters that what they had witnessed was real, as the sheer scope of the carnage seemed beyond human capability. The second horrific act that defined Vlad's reign was the systematic elimination of the boyar class, the noble families who had traditionally held power in Wallachia. These massacres weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated political purges designed to eliminate any potential challenge to his absolute authority. The boyars represented centuries of aristocratic privilege and political influence, making them natural enemies of Vlad's centralized rule. The most infamous of these purges occurred during what became known as the Easter Massacre of 1459. Vlad invited hundreds of boyar families to a grand feast at his court, ostensibly to celebrate the resurrection of Christ and demonstrate his commitment to traditional Wallachian customs. The nobles arrived in their finest clothes, accompanied by their wives and children, expecting a celebration that would reinforce their social status and political importance. The banquet hall was decorated with expensive tapestries and laden with the finest foods and wines Wallachia could offer. Vlad played the role of gracious host perfectly, personally greeting each noble family and engaging in pleasant conversation about politics, trade, and local affairs. The atmosphere was relaxed and jovial, with no hint of the horror that was about to unfold. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, Vlad rose to address his guests. His speech began with traditional pleasantries about unity and loyalty, but gradually shifted to accusations of treason and conspiracy. He recounted specific instances of boyar disloyalty during previous reigns, naming individuals and families who had allegedly betrayed Wallachia to foreign powers. The mood in the hall changed dramatically as Vlad's tone became increasingly menacing. Guards, who had been positioned discreetly around the room throughout the evening, suddenly moved to block all exits. The nobles, realizing they had walked into a trap, began to panic, but escape was impossible. Vlad had planned every detail of the evening to ensure that none of his enemies would survive to challenge him again. The massacre that followed was swift and merciless. Soldiers poured into the hall, cutting down the boyars where they sat. Some nobles tried to fight back with eating knives and makeshift weapons, but they were quickly overwhelmed by armed guards. Women and children were not spared. Vlad had decreed that entire bloodlines must be eliminated to prevent future revenge. The execution of the boyars continued for hours, with Vlad personally overseeing the carnage to ensure that no one escaped. Those who weren't killed immediately were dragged outside to be impaled, their bodies left as warnings to any other nobles who might consider opposing his rule. By dawn, the cream of Wallachian aristocracy had been eliminated in a single night of calculated violence. The political impact of this massacre was immediate and far-reaching. With the traditional noble class destroyed, Vlad was able to implement radical changes to Wallachian society without aristocratic opposition. He redistributed boyar lands to loyal supporters, created new administrative positions filled with men of his choosing, and established a system of governance that relied entirely on his personal authority rather than traditional feudal structures. The third atrocity that shocked Europe was Vlad's creation of the infamous Forest of the Impaled outside the city of Târgoviște in 1462. This grotesque monument to human suffering was the culmination of Vlad's psychological warfare campaign against the Ottoman Empire, designed to demonstrate that death was preferable to conquest by his forces. The forest represented the systematic impalement of over 20,000 Ottoman soldiers, merchants and civilians captured during various raids and battles. The creation of this horror began with Vlad's military campaigns along the Danube River, where he systematically captured Ottoman outposts and supply convoys. Rather than simply killing prisoners or holding them for ransom, as was customary in medieval warfare, Vlad ordered that all captives be transported back to Târgoviște for public execution. The sheer number of prisoners created logistical challenges that Vlad met with characteristic efficiency and ruthlessness. Preparations for the mass impalement required extensive planning and resources. Thousands of wooden stakes had to be prepared, each one carefully shaped and measured to ensure consistency in the final display. Teams of carpenters worked around the clock to produce the necessary equipment, while other workers prepared the ground outside the city walls, creating a geometric pattern of holes where the stakes would be planted. The impalement process itself took place over several days, with executions beginning at dawn each morning and continuing until sunset. Vlad personally supervised the entire operation, ensuring that the stakes were positioned at precise intervals to create the maximum visual impact. He paid particular attention to the height of each stake, creating a terraced effect that made the forest visible from great distances. The arrangement of victims followed a strict hierarchy designed to send specific messages to different audiences. Ottoman military officers were placed on the tallest stakes at the front of the forest, their bodies clearly visible to approaching armies. Common soldiers were arranged in neat rows behind them, while civilians and merchants were positioned at the rear. This organization transformed mass murder into a form of communication that could be read like a book by anyone who approached the city. The psychological effect on Ottoman forces was devastating and immediate. When Sultan Mehmed II's army finally reached Târgoviște, The sight and smell of the impaled forest was so overwhelming that many soldiers refused to advance further. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers describe men weeping openly at the sight, while others fell to their knees in prayer or simply turned and fled. The Sultan himself reportedly became physically ill and ordered his army to retreat after only briefly viewing the carnage. The forest served its intended purpose of psychological deterrence far beyond Vlad's expectations. Word of the massive impalement spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, creating a legend that would influence military planning for decades to come. Ottoman commanders began to avoid Wallachian territory entirely, preferring to find alternate routes for their campaigns, even when it meant significant delays and additional expenses. The international reaction to the Forest of the Impaled was one of shock and condemnation, even among Vlad's Christian allies. Papal representatives expressed horror at the scale of the executions, while Hungarian and Polish nobles questioned whether such methods were appropriate even against Muslim enemies. The forest became a symbol of Christian extremism that damaged Vlad's reputation among potential allies and isolated him diplomatically. Vlad's fourth horrific innovation was the implementation of a judicial system so harsh that it transformed Wallachia into a society ruled entirely by fear. His legal code made virtually every infraction punishable by death, creating an atmosphere where citizens lived in constant terror of accidentally violating one of the numerous laws that could result in immediate execution. This reign of terror extended far beyond serious crimes to include minor offenses that other societies would punish with fines or brief imprisonment. The foundation of Vlad's legal system was the principle that any challenge to social order, no matter how minor, represented a threat to his absolute authority that must be eliminated. Lying, even about trivial matters, became a capital offense punishable by impalement. Theft of any object, regardless of its value, resulted in immediate execution. Adultery, premarital sex, and even improper dress could lead to death sentences that were carried out within hours of discovery. Vlad's enforcement of these laws required an extensive network of informants and secret police who monitored the daily activities of ordinary citizens. Neighbors were encouraged to report on each other's behavior, while merchants, servants, and even family members were expected to serve as agents of the state. This surveillance system created an atmosphere of paranoia where no one could trust anyone else, effectively destroying the social bonds that held communities together. The judicial proceedings themselves were brief and arbitrary, with Vlad serving as the sole judge, jury, and executioner. Accused individuals were rarely allowed to present evidence in their defense, and witnesses for the accused were often executed alongside the original defendant for suspected complicity. The entire legal process, from accusation to execution, could be completed in a matter of hours, leaving no time for appeals or consideration of mitigating circumstances. Public executions became daily events in Wallachian towns and villages, with gallows and impalement stakes becoming permanent fixtures in every settlement. Citizens were required to attend these executions as a form of civic duty, forced to witness the consequences of disobedience while demonstrating their loyalty through their presence. These mandatory viewing sessions served as both entertainment and education, teaching the population the exact boundaries of acceptable behavior. The economic impact of this harsh legal system was severe, as trade and commerce suffered when merchants and craftsmen lived in constant fear of accidentally violating some obscure regulation. Foreign traders avoided Wallachian markets, while local artisans were afraid to innovate or experiment with new techniques that might be interpreted as suspicious activities. The paranoia and fear that permeated society stifled creativity and economic growth. Women bore a particularly heavy burden under Vlad's legal system, as he implemented numerous laws specifically targeting female behavior and autonomy. Women could be executed for adultery, for refusing their husband's demands, for gossiping, or for failing to maintain proper household standards. These laws effectively made women property of their male relatives, subject to death if they displayed any independence or violated traditional gender roles. The enforcement of Vlad's legal code created a climate where children grew up expecting violence and death as normal parts of daily life. Young people learned to speak in whispers, to avoid expressing opinions, and to monitor their own behavior constantly for signs that might be interpreted as suspicious. This psychological conditioning produced a generation of Wallachians who were thoroughly traumatized and incapable of independent thought or action. The fifth atrocity that defined Vlad's reign was his systematic targeting of women and children, groups traditionally protected by medieval codes of warfare and chivalry. His campaigns against enemy populations deliberately included the torture and execution of non-combatants, using their suffering as weapons of psychological warfare designed to break the will of opposing forces. These attacks on innocent civilians represented a calculated abandonment of moral constraints that shocked even his contemporary enemies. Vlad's military strategy specifically included the capture and public execution of enemy women and children as a means of demoralizing opposing armies. When Ottoman forces included family members traveling with supply convoys, Vlad would separate them from adult male soldiers and subject them to particularly cruel forms of torture designed to maximize their suffering while ensuring that news of their fate would reach enemy commanders. The execution methods used against women often included additional elements of sexual humiliation and degradation that went beyond simple killing. Female captives were frequently stripped naked and subjected to public assault before being impaled or burned alive. These acts served no military purpose beyond the deliberate infliction of maximum psychological trauma on both the victims and those who witnessed or heard about their suffering. Children received no mercy in Vlad's campaigns, regardless of their age or innocence. Infants were torn from their mothers' arms and impaled on smaller stakes specially prepared for their tiny bodies. Older children were forced to watch the execution of their parents before being subjected to similar fates themselves. These acts of cruelty against the innocent demonstrated Vlad's complete abandonment of any moral considerations in pursuit of his political goals. The systematic nature of these attacks on non-combatants required extensive planning and coordination, indicating that the targeting of women and children was a deliberate strategic choice rather than the result of battlefield fury or loss of control. Special equipment was prepared for the execution of smaller victims, while protocols were established for the handling and display of their bodies to maximize the psychological impact on enemies. Contemporary accounts describe entire villages where every inhabitant, regardless of age or gender, was subjected to impalement or burning. These wholesale massacres eliminated not just immediate enemies, but entire communities that might have supported opposition to Vlad's rule. The thorough nature of these eliminations ensured that no survivors remained to seek revenge or provide testimony about what had occurred. The international reaction to Vlad's targeting of innocents was particularly strong, as even medieval warfare maintained certain boundaries regarding the treatment of non-combatants. Christian chroniclers expressed horror at attacks on women and children, while Muslim scholars wrote extensively about the violation of Islamic principles regarding the protection of innocents during warfare. These condemnations came from across religious and cultural lines, indicating the universal nature of the moral boundaries Vlad had crossed. The long-term psychological impact of these atrocities extended far beyond their immediate military objectives, creating generational trauma that affected entire populations for decades after Vlad's death. Survivors of his campaigns carried physical and emotional scars that influenced their ability to form families and communities, while stories of his cruelty became cautionary tales passed down through oral tradition for centuries. Vlad's sixth innovation in the art of terror was his mastery of psychological warfare, using carefully crafted rumors and deliberate displays of cruelty to paralyze enemies before battles even began. This strategic use of terror as a weapon was unprecedented in its sophistication and effectiveness, turning Vlad's reputation into a military asset more powerful than cavalry or artillery. His psychological campaigns were so successful that many enemies surrendered or fled without fighting, making his relatively small army capable of defeating much larger forces. The foundation of Vlad's psychological warfare was the deliberate cultivation of his reputation for extreme cruelty through carefully planned acts of theater designed to spread fear throughout enemy territories. He would stage elaborate public executions specifically for the benefit of enemy spies and merchants, ensuring that detailed accounts of his methods would reach opposing commanders. These performances were calculated to create maximum psychological impact while requiring minimal military resources. Vlad's agents spread carefully crafted stories about his supernatural abilities and inhuman cruelty throughout enemy territories, using existing superstitions and fears to amplify the terror associated with his name. Tales of his ability to appear anywhere at any time, his practice of drinking human blood, and his alleged supernatural strength were deliberately encouraged and embellished to create an aura of invincibility around his person. The timing and placement of Vlad's psychological attacks were precisely calculated to achieve maximum effectiveness at crucial moments in military campaigns. He would arrange for enemy forces to discover mass impalement sites just before major battles, or ensure that captured prisoners would escape with specific stories designed to demoralize their comrades. These psychological operations required extensive intelligence networks and careful coordination with military movements. Visual displays played a crucial role in Vlad's psychological warfare, with impaled bodies and other gruesome exhibits positioned along enemy supply routes and approach paths to his territory. These displays served as both warnings and advertisements for his methods, creating psychological barriers that were often more effective than physical fortifications. Enemy forces would frequently change their routes or abandon campaigns entirely, rather than face the psychological trauma of marching through these exhibits. The use of captured enemy equipment and personal items in psychological displays added an additional layer of terror to Vlad's campaign. He would arrange the armor and weapons of defeated enemies around impalement sites, creating the impression that entire armies had been captured and executed. These displays suggested military capabilities far beyond Vlad's actual resources, while providing tangible evidence that resistance was futile. Vlad's psychological campaigns extended beyond military targets to include civilian populations in enemy territories, using terror to prevent local support for opposing forces. Stories of his treatment of collaborators and civilians who aided his enemies spread through communities, making it dangerous for residents to provide supplies or information to opposing armies. This civilian terror campaign isolated enemy forces and made their operations extremely difficult. The sophisticated nature of Vlad's psychological warfare required extensive resources and planning, including networks of agents, carefully trained performers, and substantial investments in props and staging equipment. The success of these campaigns demonstrated that psychological operations could be as important as traditional military tactics in determining the outcome of conflicts, establishing principles that would influence warfare for centuries to come. The seventh, and perhaps most disturbing aspect of Vlad's reign, was his practice of dining among the impaled victims, calmly eating elaborate meals while surrounded by the screams and moans of dying prisoners. These macabre banquets represented the ultimate expression of his psychological dominance, demonstrating his complete indifference to human suffering while forcing observers to witness his absolute power over life and death. The image of Vlad enjoying fine food and wine while victims writhed in agony nearby became one of the most enduring symbols of his cruelty. These dining exhibitions were carefully staged events designed to demonstrate Vlad's supernatural calmness and control in the face of extreme violence. He would order elaborate tables to be set up in the middle of impalement fields, complete with fine linens, expensive silverware, and multiple courses of food. The contrast between the civilized appearance of the dining arrangements and the horror of the surrounding scene created a surreal atmosphere that traumatized observers and established Vlad's reputation for inhuman detachment. Vlad would invite guests to join him at these horrific meals, including captured enemy officers, potential rivals, and foreign diplomats. These forced participants were required to maintain normal dining etiquette, while surrounded by the sounds and smells of mass death, creating psychological pressure that often broke their composure completely. Many guests became physically ill or mentally unstable after experiencing these events, spreading tales of Vlad's inhuman nature throughout Europe. The menu for these meals was deliberately luxurious and elaborate, featuring multiple courses of expensive foods and rare wines that emphasized the civilized nature of the dining experience. Vlad would engage in normal dinner conversation, discussing politics, philosophy, and cultural topics, while occasionally commenting on the artistic arrangement of the impaled bodies or the quality of their screams. This casual treatment of extreme violence demonstrated his complete psychological separation from normal human emotion. Servants were required to maintain normal dining service throughout these events, bringing courses, pouring wine, and attending to guests' needs while stepping carefully around pools of blood and avoiding the gaze of dying victims. These servants often suffered psychological breakdowns after repeatedly participating in such scenes, yet were required to continue their duties on pain of joining the impaled victims themselves. The international diplomatic community was particularly horrified by accounts of these dining exhibitions, as they violated every principle of civilized behavior recognized by medieval society. Ambassadors who witnessed or heard detailed accounts of these meals reported that they represented a level of cruelty that transcended normal human understanding, suggesting that Vlad had crossed into a realm of evil that defied rational explanation. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate words to describe these scenes, often resorting to religious language about demons and supernatural evil to explain behavior that seemed beyond human capability. The image of Vlad dining peacefully among the dying became a powerful symbol that was used in religious sermons and political propaganda for centuries, representing the ultimate corruption of human nature by absolute power. The psychological impact of these dining exhibitions extended far beyond their immediate witnesses, as detailed accounts spread throughout Europe and influenced perceptions of Eastern European politics for generations. The image of the ruler who could eat calmly while surrounded by torture and death became an archetypal representation of tyrannical power that influenced literature, art, and political thought long after Vlad's death. The political context that produced such unprecedented cruelty was rooted in the complex geopolitical situation of 15th century Eastern Europe, where small principalities like Wallachia were caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the declining Byzantine and Hungarian kingdoms. Vlad's methods, while horrifically extreme, were developed as survival strategies for a ruler whose territory was constantly threatened by much larger and more powerful neighbors. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe had created a climate of constant warfare and political instability that made traditional diplomatic and military approaches inadequate for small rulers seeking to maintain independence. Vlad understood that conventional military resistance would inevitably fail against Ottoman numerical superiority, leading him to develop asymmetric warfare tactics that prioritized psychological impact over physical destruction. The failure of Western European powers to provide meaningful assistance to Eastern European principalities fighting Ottoman expansion left rulers like Vlad with limited options for resistance. Diplomatic appeals to the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and other Christian powers produced promises of support that rarely materialized into actual military aid, forcing local rulers to develop independent strategies for survival. Vlad's childhood experiences as a hostage in the Ottoman court had provided him with intimate knowledge of Turkish military methods and psychological tactics, which he adapted and amplified for his own purposes. His education in Ottoman cruelty taught him that fear could be a more effective weapon than traditional military force, leading to his development of terror tactics that exceeded even Ottoman standards for brutality. The internal political situation in Wallachia was equally unstable, with competing boyar families constantly scheming to overthrow ruling princes and align themselves with whatever foreign power seemed most likely to guarantee their survival. This treacherous political environment required extreme measures to ensure loyalty and eliminate potential threats to central authority. The economic pressures facing Wallachia also contributed to the development of Vlad's harsh methods, as the principality lacked the resources to maintain large standing armies or extensive fortifications. Terror tactics provided a cost-effective alternative to expensive military infrastructure, allowing a relatively poor territory to project power far beyond its actual capabilities. The religious dimensions of the conflict between Christian and Muslim powers added an additional layer of justification for extreme measures, as the struggle was framed in terms of a holy war, where any methods that preserved Christian territory were considered morally acceptable. This religious context provided Vlad with ideological cover for actions that might otherwise have been condemned by his Christian allies. The technological limitations of medieval warfare also influenced the development of psychological tactics, as the absence of modern communications and rapid transportation made reputation and fear particularly important factors in military effectiveness. In an era when news traveled slowly and inaccurately, a reputation for extreme cruelty could influence events across vast distances without requiring actual military presence. The immediate consequences of Vlad's reign of terror were dramatic and far-reaching, transforming both the internal structure of Wallachian society and the external relations between Eastern European principalities and the Ottoman Empire. His methods achieved their intended goal of establishing absolute internal control while deterring external aggression, but at a cost that fundamentally altered the character of medieval warfare and governance. Within Wallachia, Vlad's harsh rule created a population that was thoroughly traumatized and completely submissive to central authority. The systematic elimination of the boyar class and the implementation of draconian legal codes destroyed traditional social structures and replaced them with a system based entirely on fear of the ruler. This transformation produced political stability but eliminated the cultural institutions and social relationships that had defined Wallachian identity for centuries. The economic impact of Vlad's rule was mixed, with some benefits from increased security and reduced internal conflict, offset by the destruction of traditional commercial relationships and the exodus of skilled craftsmen and merchants who fled the country to escape the climate of terror. Foreign trade decreased significantly as merchants avoided territories associated with such extreme violence, isolating Wallachia economically. The military effectiveness of Vlad's psychological warfare exceeded all expectations, as Ottoman forces avoided direct confrontation with Wallachian territory for decades after his death. The reputation for extreme cruelty that he had cultivated continued to influence Ottoman military planning long after he was no longer alive to implement his threats, demonstrating the lasting power of psychological deterrence. The international diplomatic consequences of Vlad's methods were severe, as his reputation for extreme cruelty made it difficult for other Christian rulers to openly support his cause, despite their shared religious and political interests. The horror associated with his methods isolated him diplomatically and prevented the formation of effective anti-Ottoman alliances that might have changed the course of European history. The cultural impact of Vlad's reign extended far beyond the borders of Wallachia, as stories of his cruelty spread throughout Europe and influenced popular attitudes toward Eastern European politics and the conduct of warfare. These tales contributed to the development of negative stereotypes about Eastern European culture that persisted for centuries and influenced Western European foreign policy toward the region. The religious implications of Vlad's methods created theological controversies within the Christian Church, as scholars debated whether such extreme measures could be justified in defense of Christian territory. These debates influenced the development of just war theory and contributed to changing attitudes toward the conduct of warfare that would affect military ethics for generations. The psychological trauma inflicted on Vlad's own people had lasting effects that influenced Wallachian culture and politics for decades after his death. The population remained suspicious of authority and resistant to social change, while the elimination of traditional institutions made it difficult to develop stable political structures that could function without the constant threat of violence. The military innovations pioneered by Vlad, particularly his use of psychological warfare and terror tactics, influenced the development of warfare throughout Europe and established precedents that would be followed by other rulers facing similar challenges. His methods demonstrated that small, weak states could effectively resist larger powers through the strategic use of terror and psychological manipulation. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler extends far beyond his historical period, influencing literature, popular culture, and political thought in ways that continue to shape our understanding of power, cruelty, and human nature. His transformation into the legendary figure of Count Dracula represents one of the most successful examples of historical fact evolving into cultural myth, demonstrating the enduring power of extreme cruelty to capture the human imagination. The literary tradition that began with Bram Stoker's Dracula drew directly on historical accounts of Vlad's cruelty, transforming a medieval tyrant into a supernatural monster who embodied the darkest aspects of human nature. This transformation reflected contemporary anxieties about power, sexuality, and the thin veneer of civilization that separates humans from beasts, themes that remain relevant in modern culture. The political legacy of Vlad's methods can be seen in the development of modern totalitarian states, which have adopted many of his techniques for psychological control and terror-based governance. The systematic use of fear as a tool of political control, the elimination of traditional social institutions, and the creation of surveillance networks to monitor citizen behavior all have precedence in Vlad's reign. The ethical questions raised by Vlad's methods continue to influence debates about the limits of acceptable behavior in warfare and governance, particularly in situations where traditional approaches have failed to achieve necessary objectives. The tension between moral principles and practical necessity that characterized his reign remains relevant in contemporary discussions about counterterrorism, military intervention, and authoritarian governance. The historical scholarship surrounding Vlad has evolved significantly over the centuries, with modern historians working to separate fact from legend while acknowledging the very real impact of his cruelty on both his contemporaries and subsequent generations. This scholarly work has revealed the complex political, economic, and cultural factors that contributed to the development of his extreme methods. The tourist industry in modern Romania has attempted to capitalize on Vlad's notoriety while downplaying the historical reality of his cruelty, creating sanitized versions of his story that emphasize his role as a defender of Christian Europe while minimizing the horror of his methods. This commercialization of historical trauma raises important questions about how societies should remember and commemorate difficult aspects of their past. The psychological study of Vlad's behavior has contributed to our understanding of how extreme power can corrupt human nature and create individuals capable of unprecedented cruelty. His case has been analyzed by historians, psychologists, and political scientists seeking to understand the conditions that produce such extreme aberrations in human behavior. The continuing fascination with Vlad's story in popular culture reflects deeper anxieties about the nature of evil and the potential for ordinary humans to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. His transformation from historical figure to cultural archetype demonstrates the power of extreme behavior to transcend specific historical contexts and become universal symbols of human capacity for both good and evil. As we reflect on the horrific legacy of Vlad the Impaler, we are confronted with fundamental questions about human nature, political power, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior that remain as relevant today as they were in the 15th century. His story serves as a stark reminder that the veneer of civilization is thin and that the capacity for extreme cruelty exists within the human experience, waiting to be unleashed under the right circumstances. The horror of his reign was not merely the product of a distant barbaric age, but a demonstration of possibilities that continue to exist within human society whenever moral constraints are abandoned in pursuit of political objectives. The 7 acts of terror that defined Vlad's reign, the mass impalements, the elimination of the boyar class, the creation of the forest of the impaled, the implementation of a draconian legal system, the targeting of innocents, the mastery of psychological warfare, and the macabre dining exhibitions represent a systematic exploration of the darkest possibilities of human behavior. Each of these innovations in cruelty pushed the boundaries of what previous generations had considered possible, establishing new standards for political terror that would influence rulers and revolutionaries for centuries to come. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Vlad's legacy is not the scale of his cruelty, but the calculated nature of his methods and their effectiveness in achieving political objectives. His reign demonstrates that extreme violence can indeed be an effective tool of governance under certain circumstances, a lesson that has been learned and reapplied by countless tyrants throughout history. This uncomfortable truth challenges modern assumptions about the relationship between moral behavior and political success, forcing us to confront the possibility that goodness and effectiveness are not always aligned. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to cultural legend reflects our ongoing struggle to understand and process the reality of extreme evil in human experience. By turning him into a supernatural monster, we distance ourselves from the uncomfortable truth that his cruelty was entirely human in origin, and therefore represents a potential that exists within our own species. The vampire legend allows us to explore our fascination with extreme evil, while maintaining the comforting fiction that such behavior is fundamentally inhuman. Yet the historical reality of Vlad the Impaler cannot be dismissed as mere legend or relegated to the realm of supernatural horror. The documented accounts of his cruelty, preserved in diplomatic correspondence, chronicles, and official records from across Europe, provide undeniable evidence that human beings are capable of systematically inflicting suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. His story stands as a permanent reminder that the potential for such evil exists within human society and requires constant vigilance to prevent its emergence. The final lesson of Vlad's reign may be that the price of political survival can sometimes be so high that it destroys the very civilization it seeks to preserve. His methods may have temporarily protected Wallachia from foreign conquest, but they created a society so traumatized and brutalized that it lost its essential humanity in the process. In seeking to defend his people through extreme measures, Vlad ultimately transformed them into something no longer worth defending, a cautionary tale that resonates through the centuries to our own troubled age.